The night the Mafia boss broke his own rules was the night everything changed. In his world, there were only two laws: never trust anyone and never touch the staff. He enforced those rules without mercy. People had disappeared for less. But then there was her. She was just a maid, quiet, invisible, the kind of person no one ever noticed, except him. At first, it was nothing, a glance, a pause that lasted a second too long, until one night he made a decision that could destroy everything he had built. And the moment he did, he realized she wasn't just a maid, and he had just crossed a line he could never come back from.
His name was Oliver Voss. And if you didn't know that name, you were either very lucky or very new to the city. Oslo's underworld didn't run on fear alone. It ran on precision, on silence, on the kind of cold, calculated control that only one man had ever managed to maintain for over a decade without a single crack. That man was Oliver. 34 years old, 6'2" of composed, measured lethality, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. People didn't cross Oliver Voss twice. Most didn't survive crossing him once. He had built his empire the way a surgeon builds a career: clean hands, sharp instruments, and the absolute refusal to let emotion anywhere near the operating table. His estate sat on the edge of the city like a quiet threat: stone walls, iron gates, 12 rooms and a staff of 9, each one vetted, screened, and interviewed 3 times before ever setting foot inside. Every one of them had signed documents they didn't fully understand. Every one of them knew the most important unspoken rule of working in the Voss household. You were furniture. You existed to serve, to maintain, to disappear into the background. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not linger in hallways. You did not look too long at anything: the artwork, the documents on desks, the visitors who arrived after midnight in dark cars with no plates. And you absolutely, under no circumstances, made yourself noticed by the man who owned the house. Oliver had a second-in-command named Johann Merck. Broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed, loyal in the way only men who owe their lives to someone can be. Johann managed the staff like he managed everything else, with zero tolerance for mistakes. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he simply made the rules clear, once. No one needed to be told twice. Then there was Valdemar, the strategist, lean, sharp-tongued, brilliant in the way that made you nervous. Robert, who handled external contracts and had a smile that never reached his eyes. And Asher, the youngest at 28, reckless and sharp, and somehow always in the right place at exactly the right moment. Together, they ran an operation that moved money, influence, and power across 4 countries and 2 continents. Quietly, efficiently, perfectly. Because Oliver demanded nothing less. His rules were simple, just 2 of them. Never trust anyone. Never touch the staff. The first rule existed because Oliver had learned it the hard way, at 17, when the man he trusted most handed his father's location to a rival and watched the consequences from a safe distance. That lesson had been written into his bones. Trust was a luxury, a weakness dressed up in noble clothing. The second rule existed because Oliver understood something most men in his position didn't. Power requires distance. The moment you blur the lines between the people who serve you and the people who matter to you, you create a vulnerability, a soft spot. And soft spots get people killed. He had watched it happen to others. Men who grew fond of a cook, a driver, a woman who cleaned their offices, men who let affection cloud their judgment, only to discover too late that the softness they'd allowed had been noted, cataloged, weaponized. Oliver had no soft spots. He was certain of that. He was wrong. Her name was Camila Reyes. She arrived on a Tuesday in early November, referred through an agency Johan had used twice before. The file was thin, 26 years old, Spanish-born, Norwegian-raised, 2 previous households, with both letters of recommendation that said the same thing in slightly different words: reliable, discreet, efficient. Oliver glanced at the file for approximately 4 seconds. "Fine," he said. That was all.
He didn't think about her again, or so he told himself. Camila arrived with a dark braid down her back, a gray uniform, and an expression so thoroughly neutral it was almost remarkable. Not nervous, not performing calm, genuinely, quietly, composed. The way a person looks when they've decided before entering the room exactly what they're willing to show and what stays locked behind glass. Johan gave her the tour: kitchen, east wing, west corridor. The study was off limits. The garage was off limits. The north staircase led only to Mr. Voss's private quarters and was never, under any circumstances, used by staff. Camila nodded at each instruction. She didn't ask a single question. Johan noticed that. Most new staff asked at least 3. Some asked 10. She asked none. He filed that away, said nothing. Her first week passed without incident. She was good at the job, exceptionally good, in the quiet, invisible way that real skill always announces itself. Floors cleaned before anyone noticed they were dirty. Linens replaced on a schedule that anticipated need rather than waited for request. She moved through the house like a current of air, present, functional, unremarkable. Except, on the 4th morning, Oliver came downstairs early. A call from Valdemar at 5:45 had pulled him out of sleep and into the kind of cold, alert focus that certain information demands. He moved through the east hallway toward his study, his mind already 3 steps ahead of his feet, and he stopped. Not because something was wrong, because something felt different. The new maid, he hadn't even confirmed her name yet, was standing at the window at the end of the hall, back to him, doing nothing, just standing there, looking out at the gray morning, a folded cloth in her hand, completely still. And it wasn't the stillness of someone resting, it was the stillness of someone thinking, deeply, privately, someone whose mind was somewhere far from that hallway. Oliver stood there for a moment he did not account for. Then he continued to his study and told himself he'd forgotten it, but he hadn't. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in that exact moment, Camila had seen his reflection in the window glass. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but she had seen him, noted the time, 5:52 in the morning, noted that he was already dressed, already sharp, which meant the call had required him to be ready for something fast. She filed that away, said nothing. The weeks that followed had a rhythm. Oliver's world ran on precision, meetings at scheduled hours, arrivals and departures like clockwork, the controlled machinery of an empire that depended on nothing unexpected ever happening inside these walls. The staff were props in that machinery.
But something had shifted, something so small that no one named it, not even Oliver, who named everything. It started with the coffee. He drank it black, 2 cups every morning, precisely brewed, not too strong, not too weak. His previous housekeeper had taken 6 months to calibrate it perfectly. Camila had calibrated it in 3 days. He hadn't told her how he liked it. He hadn't been asked. She had simply observed what he left in the cup each morning, the last inch always untouched when it was too bitter, the cup drained completely when it was right, and adjusted until the cup was always empty. He noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. Then there was the lamp. Oliver's study operated on a precise arrangement, certain lights on, certain lights off, the same setup for 3 years. She had moved one lamp, just one, to the corner position where it cast light across the reading chair at the angle that reduced glare on whatever book was left open on the side table. He stood in the doorway of his study and stared at it. No one had ever touched that lamp. It was such a small thing, such a precise, observant, completely unnecessary thing to do for a man who had never asked for it and would never acknowledge it. He didn't acknowledge it. But 3 days later, when Johann ran a routine staff review, Oliver's response was 2 words longer than usual. "She's fine. Keep her." Johann didn't react, just nodded and moved on. But he had worked alongside Oliver for 9 years, long enough to know that "keep her" was not a throwaway line. In a household where staff were reviewed and replaced with the same detachment applied to everything, "keep her" meant something. What exactly, Johann couldn't say yet, but he filed it away.
The first real moment happened on a Wednesday night in December. A meeting had run long. Oliver's associates had gathered in the West Wing. Valdemar, Robert, 2 men whose names were never used aloud inside the house. The conversation had grown tense in the way that certain conversations do when money and unspoken threats are crowded into the same room. By the time the last car pulled out of the gates, it was past midnight. The weight of the evening sat on Oliver's shoulders like stone. He walked to the kitchen. Not out of habit, he never went to the kitchen at this hour, but the walls of the house felt like something pressing in, and his mind was loud, and sometimes moving through a quiet space helped silence the machinery inside his head. He pushed open the door. She was there. Camila stood at the counter with a glass of water in her hand, not working, not cleaning, just there, the way anyone is when they come downstairs at midnight for a glass of water. She looked up when he entered. For a moment, neither of them moved. In 3 years of running this household, no staff member had ever been in this room when Oliver walked in after midnight. The rules were clear. The hours were clear. But she wasn't breaking a rule, not technically. There was no rule against water at midnight. What happened next was not dramatic. It was just a pause that lasted too long. Oliver crossed to the cabinet, retrieved a glass, filled it, drank, set it down. And then, without intending to, without planning it, before the door inside him could close fast enough, he said, "Long night?" Not a question, not directed anywhere, just the sound of a man who had been carrying silence too long, and one small word had escaped before he could catch it. Camila looked at him. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes, something very quiet, very careful, acknowledged that he had spoken. "Yes," she said. One word, perfectly calibrated. He nodded once, left the kitchen, went upstairs. He didn't sleep for another 2 hours. What he didn't know was that Camila stood in that kitchen long after he left, her hand pressed flat on the counter. Her expression, now that no one was watching, was no longer neutral. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like conflict. After that night, everything changed. Not dramatically, not visibly. If you were watching from outside, you'd have seen nothing. A household running as it always had. A man going about his days with controlled efficiency. A maid doing her job with quiet precision. But something was different, something electric,
and dangerous and completely without permission. Oliver started noticing her, not the way he noticed threats, clinically, cataloging, but the way you notice a sound that doesn't fit the background noise. The way she moved through a room as if she'd already mapped it before entering. The way she paused sometimes, just briefly, when voices carried from behind a closed door, her head tilting almost imperceptibly before she continued on her way. He told himself it was nothing. He was overworked. The pressure of the last quarter had frayed something at the edges of his discipline. He was imagining things. He told himself a lot of things. None of them stuck. One afternoon he was in the library when she came to dust the shelves. Standard, expected. He was at his desk. She was behind him, present but irrelevant, the way furniture is present but irrelevant. Except she paused, at the shelf to his left. He didn't look up, but he tracked the pause the way he tracked everything. She had stopped near a specific book. He knew exactly which one without looking, because he knew every inch of this library. Dostoevsky, third shelf, slightly pulled from the others because he'd been reading it 2 nights ago and hadn't pushed it back. She didn't touch it, but the pause lasted exactly the length of time it takes a person to read the title and register what it means. Then she moved on. He waited until she left the room. Then he looked at the shelf. The book was exactly where he'd left it. But the idea that she had noticed it, recognized it, possibly, sat in his chest in a way he couldn't categorize. That evening he asked Johann casually, eyes still on his desk, "The new maid, what's her background?" Johann paused, just a fraction. Agency referral, 2 previous households, clean record. Before that. Before the agency? Yes. A longer pause now. I'd have to look deeper into the file. Do that, Oliver said, flat, final. Johann left, and Oliver Voss sat alone in his study feeling something he had not felt in a long time. He couldn't name it, didn't want to name it, but it was there, warm and inconvenient and entirely without logic. What he didn't know, what the photograph on Johann's desk would reveal in exactly 9 days, was that the warmth he was feeling was the most dangerous thing that had ever entered his house. More dangerous than any rival, more dangerous than any weapon, because it was already too late to lock the door. The line broke on a Friday. Not violently, not in the way lines usually break in Oliver's world, with consequence and sound and irreversible momentum. It broke quietly, the way the most dangerous things always do. He had gone to the garden. Unusual. Oliver was not a garden person. The estate had grounds because estates had grounds, but he hadn't stood out here voluntarily in months, maybe longer. But that evening, the walls of the house felt like they were closing in, and he had gone outside without a plan, which was also unusual, and stood in the cold December air with his hands in his pockets and let the quiet hit him. He didn't hear her come out. She was simply there, sitting on the stone bench at the far edge of the garden, partially hidden by the skeletal arms of a winter bare hedge, a book in her lap, not reading, looking at the sky. He should have gone back inside. He didn't. He walked toward her, not quickly, not with intention, but steadily, the way a person moves when their feet have made a decision their mind hasn't approved yet. She heard him and looked up. Her expression settled into that composed, unreadable arrangement, but her hands, he noticed, pressed slightly flatter against the book in her lap. "You're outside," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out like one anyway. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can go in." "I didn't say that." She didn't move. He didn't move either, and the air between them, which had been carrying something unspoken for weeks, felt suddenly very, very full. "What are you reading?" he asked. The question surprised her. He saw it, that briefest flicker behind her eyes, quickly controlled. She turned the book so he could see the cover. It was in Russian. He looked at it, then at her. "You read Russian?" "A little," she said. He sat down on the bench, not beside her. There was deliberate distance,
but on the same bench, in the same cold air, in the same garden that belonged to him and that she had no real business being in after hours. "Why Russian?" he asked. Another small flicker. "It was available when I was learning." "Where?" A pause, controlled. "Moscow for a year, a long time ago." He looked at the garden. She looked at the book, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable, because silences between Oliver Voss and other people were always either functional or tense. This was neither. "You're observant," he said, low, direct. She looked up. "It's a useful quality. In a maid? In anyone." He turned to look at her then, fully for the first time without the pretense of looking at something else. She met his gaze, didn't drop it, didn't perform nervousness or flattery or careful deference, just looked back at him the way an equal looks at another equal. He had not been looked at without fear in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. Something shifted behind the walls he had spent 17 years building. He stood up. "Go inside," he said. Not unkind, just final. She rose, tucked the book under her arm, and walked past him toward the house, close enough that he could have reached out. He didn't, but the want was there, and Oliver Voss, who had spent a lifetime refusing to want things he couldn't control, stood in the cold garden and understood with perfect clarity that he was in trouble, real trouble. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had built a full, logical argument for why the thing happening between them needed to stop. The argument was thorough, well-reasoned, completely correct. He proceeded to act entirely against its conclusions. He began, in small, careful ways he told himself weren't what they were, to seek her out. Not obviously. Nothing was ever obvious with Oliver, but he found reasons to be in rooms she was cleaning. He took his morning coffee at the kitchen counter instead of his study. He passed through the east hallway at hours when he had no particular reason to be there. And she was always present, calm, working, meeting his gaze for exactly the right number of seconds before returning to what she was doing. Always that perfect, calibrated response that gave nothing away, and yet somehow gave everything away.
They talked, slowly, carefully, the way conversations build between two guarded people who are both aware of what they're doing and both pretending they're not. Books, cities. He learned she had lived in 4 countries. She learned, not from what he said, but from what he didn't say, the shape of a life defined by necessity and control. One morning, he asked how she'd ended up at the agency. She answered without hesitation, clean, simple, detailed enough to seem transparent. Previous household dissolved, needed work. A contact referred her. All true, he suspected, and also not the whole truth. He let it go, for the moment. What he didn't know was that while he was asking those questions, while he was letting the distance close and the second rule bend and the warmth grow, someone had been watching, someone on the inside, and they were already making a phone call. 9 days after the garden, Johann came to the study late on a Sunday evening. He set a single printed page on the desk without a word. Oliver looked at it. A photograph, old, 5, maybe 6 years, grainy, slightly overexposed, the way photos taken without permission always are. In it, a young woman stood outside a building, European city, Prague, possibly Warsaw. She was dressed differently, hair shorter, her expression the opposite of the composed neutrality Oliver knew. In the photograph, she looked alert, focused, professional, and standing beside her was a man Oliver recognized immediately. His blood ran cold. Daniel Strauss, head of intelligence operations for the Ericsson Group, Oliver's longest-standing, most dangerous rivals. He sat with the photograph for a long time. Johann stood on the other side of the desk and said nothing, because Johann knew how Oliver processed information, in silence, completely. When Oliver finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed. It never changed, but something behind his eyes had gone very, very cold. "How certain," he said. "Facial recognition, 91% match," Johann said. "It's her." Oliver placed the photograph face down on the desk, straightened a pen that didn't need straightening, and in the same tone he used for quarterly financials, he said, "Don't approach her. Don't change anything. I'll handle it." Johann left. Oliver sat alone. He had known something was off. He had felt it, that particular texture of wrongness his instincts were designed to detect, and he had let weeks go by without pulling the thread. Because some part of him, some part he was furious at right now, had not wanted to pull it. He had broken the first rule. He had trusted, not completely, not blindly, but enough to let the distance close, enough to let himself have a conversation in the garden he never should have had. And now the question wasn't whether he'd been compromised. The question was how much. What had she found? What had she already sent back? And the most dangerous question of all, the one that kept him in that study long after the house had gone quiet, was any of it real? He thought about the lamp. He thought about the coffee. He thought about her hands pressing flat against the book when he walked toward her in the garden. He didn't have an answer. And not having an answer was for Oliver Voss the most terrifying thing in the world. He watched her differently after that, not with warmth, with the clinical, surgical attention he applied to threats, because she was a threat now. That was the operating assumption, the frame through which everything was filtered. Every calm glance, calculated, every small, precise gesture that had seemed like quiet attentiveness, data collection. Every moment in that kitchen at midnight, every conversation in the library, every second of that garden bench, performance. He watched her pour his coffee and thought, she has been performing this entire time. He watched her look up at him with those steady eyes and thought, none of it was real. He was almost convinced, and then she did something that didn't fit the frame.
One of his men, Asher, the youngest, had come by the house unexpectedly, visibly shaken. Oliver had been occupied and sent him to wait in the sitting room. When Oliver arrived 20 minutes later, Asher was calmer, and on the table beside him was a cup of tea he hadn't asked for. Oliver looked at it, looked at Asher, who shrugged slightly. "The maid," he said. "She just brought it." Oliver said nothing. But that evening, he replayed the moment with the same cold, analytical eye he'd been using all week, and he couldn't make it fit. Bringing tea to a distressed young man who had nothing to do with anything she was supposed to be investigating, that was not a strategic action. That was an instinct, a human instinct. And that bothered him more than the photograph, because the photograph was evidence. He knew how to handle evidence. The tea was something else. The tea made him wonder if the woman in the photograph and the woman in his house were not exactly the same person. Wondering, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. He couldn't afford to wonder. He picked up the phone anyway. He confronted her on a Tuesday evening.
He waited until the house was quiet, until the last of the staff had gone to their rooms. Then he knocked on the door of the small sitting room off the east corridor, where he knew she would be, because he had spent weeks learning her patterns without meaning to. She opened the door, no surprise on her face, which told him something. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He crossed to the table by the window, where he had placed the photograph face down earlier that evening. He turned it over, set it in front of her. She looked at it. And here's what she didn't do. She didn't panic, didn't perform shock, didn't manufacture confusion or outrage, or any of the dozen responses a person rehearses for a moment like this. Instead, her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but he was watching for imperceptible. And what crossed her face was something he had not expected. It looked like relief.
"How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Who are you?" Not a question, a requirement. She held his gaze. "My name is Camila," she said. "That part is real. And the rest?" A beat. "My full name is Camila Reyes Strauss." The room went very quiet. Oliver said nothing. He let the name sit between them like a loaded weapon. "Daniel Strauss," he said finally. "My uncle," she said. He absorbed that. The shape of the trap became clear in his mind. Clean, elegant, brutally effective. An operative embedded in his household. A family connection to his most dangerous rival. Weeks of access to his home, his routines, his archive. "Your purpose here," he said. She held his gaze. Didn't flinch. "I was sent to find a file. Specifically, documentation that connects the Voss operation to the Halvorsen trafficking network." She paused. "My uncle believed you had it. He wanted it to use against you." Oliver said nothing. "I found it. 3 weeks ago. East Archive. 3rd drawer." He went very still. "I hadn't sent it." The silence that followed had weight. Real. Physical weight. "Why?" he said.
She looked at the photograph, then back at him. "Because the file proves what I already suspected, that the connection to Halvorsen was manufactured, planted. The documentation was created, not discovered." She held his gaze. "Which means someone wanted it to exist, wanted it to be found, wanted it traced back to you." Oliver's expression didn't move, but something behind his eyes, the click of a mechanism aligning. "Someone who knew the file would be accessed," he said slowly. "Someone who knew I was coming," she said. "Someone who told my uncle exactly where the documentation would be and exactly what it would prove." The implication landed like a stone in still water. Someone inside. Someone who had built this trap from both ends, planted the evidence, and sent the operative to find it. A perfect collision designed to destroy the Voss operation from the inside and outside simultaneously. Oliver turned to the window. His mind was already moving, already running through names, timelines, access points, already identifying who, among the people he had trusted most, had the position and the motive and the cold nerve to architect something this precise. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then, "Don't leave the house." He walked out. And what he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing yet, was that the clock was already running, that the person who had built this trap had also built a failsafe, a backup plan for the moment the operative went silent. And that failsafe had already been triggered. Oliver called a meeting for early the next morning. Johan, Valdemar, Robert, Asher. The 5 of them in the study at 7 a.m., coffee untouched, the photograph and 3 other documents Oliver had prepared overnight spread across the desk. He laid out the situation, clean, precise, the planted documentation, the embedded operative, the setup running from both sides simultaneously. Then he watched their faces. He had learned at 17 that betrayals don't announce themselves. They sit quietly in familiar rooms, wearing familiar expressions, waiting for the moment their value is greatest. He watched now. Johan, controlled alarm, the alarm of a man whose vetting had been bypassed, honest. Valdemar, sharp, angular calculation, mapping implications in real time, also honest. Asher, young and frightened and trying to hide it, honest. Robert, concern. Smooth, symmetric, perfectly pitched concern. And it was the only thing in the room that didn't quite fit. Oliver had known Robert for 9 years. He knew his tells, the way you know the tells of someone you've watched across high-stakes tables for nearly a decade. Robert, under genuine pressure, went too still. His hands stopped moving. Right now, Robert's hands were moving with a slight excess of naturalness, the micro-expression of a man who had rehearsed being calm. Oliver said nothing about it. He continued the briefing, assigned tasks, watched Robert leave with the others. Then he picked up the phone. Not to anyone in his operation, to a woman named Eleanor. She operated in a space with no official name, and she owed Oliver a debt she had been clear she'd repay exactly once. "I need everything on Robert Hagen," he said. "Everything that moved in the last 12 months. A pause. "That's the repayment. That's the repayment." He hung up and sat in the silence of his study. 9 years. He and Robert had been in this together for 9 years. Through 3 hostile takeovers, 2 betrayals from rival factions, 1 night in Prague where Oliver had personally made sure Robert walked away breathing when it seemed absolutely certain he wouldn't.
9 years. He had been wrong about people before, but never like this. Never someone this close. The next 4 days were the most dangerous of Oliver's career. He had to operate as if nothing had changed, had to look Robert in the eye during routine meetings and respond to his managed expressions of concern with the same controlled equanimity Robert expected to see, had to maintain the machinery while beneath it a fuse burned. He also had to decide what to do about Camila. She had stayed in the house. She continued working, not with the composed neutrality of before, but with something more deliberate, more careful, as if she knew she was being watched now with different eyes and was choosing, consciously, not to perform, just to be, which made her, somehow, more visible than she had ever been. They spoke twice during those 4 days, brief, functional, carrying everything they were not saying underneath the surface. On the second evening, she stopped him in the corridor, quietly, no drama. She pressed a small USB drive into his hand. "Everything I found," she said, "and everything I sent," a pause, "which is nothing." She held his gaze. "I need you to be able to verify that." He looked at the drive. He looked at her. "I know why you don't trust me," she said. "I want you to be able to anyway." He pocketed the drive and walked away without a word.
But that night, alone with the drive and his laptop and every verification tool he had, he found the truth. The file had been found. The file had not been transmitted. Her communications from the past 6 weeks were visible and fully accounted for. They told a story of someone who had come here with a mission, and somewhere in the middle of that mission, made a different choice. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about a garden in December, and a Russian novel, and a lamp moved to the right position by someone who had been paying attention to what he needed before he knew he needed it. He thought about what it meant that any of that could be both calculated and real. He thought about the tea, and the walls he had built at 17 years old, the walls he had reinforced every single day since, did something they had never done before. They didn't fall, but they cracked. Eleanor's information came on the 5th day. Oliver read it alone, twice. Robert Hagen had been approached 14 months ago. Representatives of the Erickson Group, not directly, 3 layers of intermediary, the kind of careful, deniable approach that leaves no fingerprints. He had been offered a relocation package, a clear debt Oliver didn't know Robert had, and a number generous enough to make any man reconsider what loyalty meant. Robert had taken it. He had recommended the agency, the specific agency, subtly manipulated the vetting process, nothing overt, nothing that would flag a review, just a small alteration in the channel through which the referral arrived, ensuring Camila's file reached Johann looking legitimate. He had planted the documentation in the East Archive himself, 3 months ago, during a routine review he had volunteered to conduct, a gesture Oliver had accepted without question because Robert had been doing things like that for 9 years, and 9 years of reliable behavior will make any man lower his guard.
and he had given Daniel Strauss the exact location of the file and the exact details of what it would prove. He had built the entire trap, both halves. Oliver sat with this for 1 hour.
He thought about Prague, about the night he had made sure Robert walked away breathing. He didn't feel what most people would feel in that moment. No rage, no grief, just a coldness so complete it was almost clarifying. He picked up the phone and called Johann. What happened to Robert Hagen is not the point of this story. What matters is this: it was handled, quietly, with precision. Robert did not disappear. Oliver was not that kind of man, regardless of what the world believed. Robert was removed, contained, made to fully understand the scope of what he had done and what it had cost, and offered a choice. He made the only one that left him breathing. The Erickson group lost their inside man, their planted evidence, their operative, all in 48 hours that no one outside the estate ever knew about. By every measure, a clean resolution. Except, in the aftermath, in the quiet that follows a storm, Oliver found himself standing at the door of the east sitting room again. And the knock he gave this time had a completely different quality than the last. Camila opened the door. She looked at him. "It's handled," he said. She nodded, waited. "You could have sent the file," he said. "At any point, you had 6 weeks and full access." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet, not constructing an answer, deciding how honestly to give the one she already had. "Because the man I was briefed on and the man I found were different, and I don't burn people for things they didn't do." He stood in the doorway.
The house was completely quiet. Outside, the December night pressed against the windows, and the lamp in the corner, his lamp, moved to the right position by someone who had been paying attention, cast the room in the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. "You're not a maid," he said. "No," she said, "but I was good at it." And something crossed his face, something that on any other face would be recognized immediately. On his, it was subtler, more private, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. "What do you actually do?" he said. "Investigative work, private contracts, some of it less clearly defined. For your uncle." Historically. A pause. "That relationship is complicated." "I imagine it is." The silence that followed was the kind that had become, over weeks, not uncomfortable, but full, heavy with everything two careful, guarded people had been not saying to each other, since a kitchen at midnight and a cold bench in December. "You should leave," he said. "The house, the city. Your connection to Erickson needs to be fully severed and verifiable. I have enemies who will look for edges." "I know," she said. "Johann will make arrangements. Safe ones." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" she asked. The question landed exactly where she intended. Oliver looked at the window, at the lamp, at the book on the table beside her chair. Different book now, but still in Russian. He thought about a garden bench in December. He thought about 2 laws that had governed 17 years of his life, and the night one of them had begun to bend. "No," he said.
The word came out quiet, direct, more honest than almost anything he had said in years. "It isn't what I want." The room held that admission. "But it's what makes sense," he said. "Given everything." "Sense," she said, "has never really been the point of anything that matters." He turned to look at her. Those steady, unfrightened eyes, looking back at him the way they always had, without deference, without performance, honestly. Even when everything around them had been constructed, she had looked at him honestly.
"You're dangerous," he said. "Not a warning, an acknowledgement." "So are you," she said. He stood in the doorway. One step. That was all it was. One step across a threshold into a room he had told himself he would never enter. One step that broke the second rule the way the first had already been broken. Quietly, completely, without the ability to take it back. He stepped into the room.
But the story wasn't over. Because 3 months later, when the estate had found a new rhythm, when Robert's removal had settled into the architecture of the operation like a healed fracture, when something new and still unnamed had taken root in the East sitting room, a package arrived. No return address. Routed through 4 intermediaries in the way that messages in their world sometimes were. Inside, a single document. Oliver read it once, then again. It was the original. Not the planted file, not the manufactured evidence. The original documentation from a case that predated Oliver's rise by several years. The case that had been the origin point of the entire manufactured frame. The case where the real corruption had always lived. And it was not about Oliver. It was about Daniel Strauss, Camilla's uncle, the man who had sent her here, the man who had been running the Halverson connection himself, not as a frame for Oliver, as a genuine, ongoing operation, one that had run for years before a certain investigator had come too close to uncovering it.
The way to bury that discovery, the most elegant way, the most destructive way, had been to redirect it, to manufacture a version of the story where the corruption pointed somewhere else, to use the investigator herself to deliver the frame, to use Camila. He had known what he was doing when he sent her here. He had banked on her professional loyalty to transmit the file without questioning its origins. He had miscalculated only one thing: his niece's particular, inconvenient, unshakable commitment to the truth. Oliver set the document on the table. He looked across it at Camila. She was looking at the document. And for the first time since he had known her, the composure was gone. Not collapsed, not broken, but stripped down to something beneath it. Something raw and tired, and quietly, deeply furious at its edges. "He used me," she said. Not to Oliver, not a question, just the sound of a thing being named out loud for the first time. "Yes," he said. She sat with that. The room was very quiet. Then she looked up.
What happens now? Oliver looked at the document, thought about what it meant, the leverage it represented, the things it could be used for, the ways a man in his position could deploy information like this against an enemy who had spent over a year trying to dismantle everything he'd built. And then he slid it across the table to her. "That's yours," he said. "What you do with it is your decision." She looked at the document, looked at him. "You could use this," she said. "I could. Against him, against Erickson. You could end this." "I could," he said again. "I'm choosing not to." Silence. She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not very Mafia of you," she said. And Oliver Voss, who had not smiled in any way that reached his eyes in longer than he could clearly remember, did something that surprised them both. He laughed. Short, almost foreign in the room, but completely, undeniably real. The kind of sound that happens when a person is surprised into genuineness, when the armor drops for one unguarded second, and what's underneath turns out to be something entirely, surprisingly, human. She was smiling too, small, warm, entirely unperformed. And in that quiet room, with the lamp casting light at the correct angle, and a document on the table that held the kind of power both of them knew how to wield and were choosing, together, not to. Two people who had been shaped by worlds that demanded they be less than they were,
sat across from each other and were, simply, themselves. The night the Mafia boss broke his own rules was the night everything changed. He had built his empire on 2 laws, enforced them without mercy, believed with a certainty that only a very alone person can carry, that the laws were what kept everything standing.
What he learned, in the end, was that the rules had never been about protection. They had been about fear. The fear of being seen, the fear of mattering to someone, the fear that if you let anything real get close, it would be taken from you the way everything real had been taken before. And the woman who had stood in his garden with a Russian novel, who had moved his lamp to the right position and brought tea to a frightened young man, and chosen, at the exact moment it cost the most, to tell the truth instead of complete the mission. She hadn't dismantled his world. She had simply shown him what his world was actually for. Not the power, not the empire, not the machinery of control that had kept him safe and alone for 17 years. Something smaller than all of that. Something harder to protect, and infinitely more worth protecting. He had stepped out of the room he had built for himself. The door was still open, and Oliver Voss, feared by everyone, known by no one, alone in every room he had ever stood in, had no intention of going back. Some rules exist to protect you, and some rules exist to protect you from the one thing you need most. Knowing the difference is everything.
Please like and subscribe for more interesting stories.